Jonathan Hale had never believed in ghosts. He made his living writing about them, sure. His best-selling horror novels earned him critical acclaim and just enough to buy the old sports car he'd always wanted. But in his heart, he was a skeptic, weaving shadows into stories to sell them to people who needed a thrill. So when he saw Blackwood Manor listed at auction, dirt cheap and shrouded in legend, he couldn't resist. It was the perfect place to finish his next novel. The villagers watched from their windows as Jonathan's car crunched up the gravel drive. Some whispered prayers, others shut their blinds. No one came to greet him. The manor loomed. Ivy-choked walls, crumbling turrets, boarded windows. It looked like something straight from a Gothic painting. Jonathan grinned. "Perfect," he murmured. The first week passed uneventfully. Jonathan explored the mansion's endless rooms, marveling at the decay and grandeur. He set up his writing desk in the old library and let the house's atmosphere seep into his work. But soon, the whispers came. At first, they were faint, like the rustling of pages or the sigh of old wood. Then they grew sharper. Fragments of sentences, names he didn't know, pleading voices. Jonathan tried to record them, but the sounds never reached his tape. Only he could hear them. Sleep became difficult. Every night the whispers grew closer, until they seemed to breathe right beside his ear. He began to write frantically, unsure whether the words were his own or fed by the house. The visions started on the 14th night. Jonathan would find himself standing in places he didn't remember walking to. The basement, the attic, the overgrown gardens. He began to dream of a woman chained in a dark room, her eyes filled with desperation. One stormy evening, driven by a force he couldn't explain, Jonathan discovered the hidden stairway behind a tapestry. It led deep underground, into the earth below the manor. He descended with trembling hands, lantern light flickering against damp stone walls. At the bottom, he found the chamber. There she was, the woman from his dreams, bound by chains that glowed faintly in the darkness. Her lips moved, but no sound came. When Jonathan touched the chains, they dissolved. She rose with a grace that was almost human, but only almost. Her face flickered between beauty and monstrosity, her limbs elongating unnaturally. Jonathan fell to his knees, his mind assaulted by visions, centuries of death, of souls consumed, of the Bellamy's desperate last attempt to imprison her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice a blend of seduction and hunger. Jonathan tried to run. He never made it to the stairs. Outside, the villagers felt the shift. Lights flickered across Blackwood. Animals fled into the woods. Children cried in their sleep, plagued by dreams of a woman they had never met. Eleanor Pritchard, the village elder, gathered the council. "The wards have failed," she told them. "We have to act." But they all knew. It might already be too late. Jonathan awoke in the manor, but he was no longer himself. The woman had marked him, threading her essence through his body. His eyes glowed faintly in the dark. He heard the whispers more clearly now, understood their language. He was her vessel. By day, he wandered the manor's halls, lost in half-remembered thoughts. By night, he walked the village streets, unseen, whispering in the ears of sleeping children, planting dreams of fear and sorrow. The villagers lit protective fires and painted old symbols on their doors, but the whispers seeped through. Eleanor knew there was only one chance. They had to reseal the entity before it regained full strength. With a group of villagers, she ventured to the manor. They carried ancient texts, relics of the Bellamy family, and the last remnants of the old magic. Inside, the house groaned and shuddered. Shadows moved where no light fell. Jonathan waited for them at the top of the stairs, a faint smile playing on his lips. "She's coming," he whispered. In the cellar, the villagers formed a circle around the altar. Eleanor began the incantation, her voice steady despite the tremors in her hands. The woman appeared, rising from the darkness, her form flickering and unstable. Jonathan screamed as she reached for him, her claws sinking into his chest. Eleanor's voice rose, weaving the ancient words. The chains reformed, wrapping around the woman's limbs, pulling her back toward the altar. but she fought. The walls shook. Blood dripped from Jonathan's mouth as he collapsed. With a final surge of strength, Eleanor completed the spell. The entity let out a piercing shriek as the chains snapped tight, dragging her back into the stone. The manor fell silent. The villagers carried Jonathan's limp body back to the village. He was alive but broken, his mind scarred by what he had seen. Eleanor stood at the edge of the manor grounds, watching the gates swing shut. "This place must never open again," she murmured. But deep in the cellar, beneath layers of stone and magic, the entity smiled. The whispers would return. Jonathan Hale sat in the small attic room the villagers had given him, staring at the cracked mirror. His reflection stared back with hollow eyes. Every night, the whispers clawed at his mind, pulling at the frayed edges of his sanity. Eleanor visited him often, bringing herbal teas and old charms, but they offered no relief. In the stillness of the night, he heard her voice, not Eleanor's, but the woman's. "You freed me once, Jonathan. You'll do it again." His body trembled, but inside, something darker stirred, a hunger he couldn't understand. The village of Blackwood was no longer safe. Children woke screaming from nightmares of cold hands pulling them into dark waters. Livestock were found mutilated, their bodies arranged in strange, spiraling patterns. Villagers began to vanish without a trace. A farmer, a seamstress, a priest. Eleanor felt the dread curling through the streets. She gathered the council again, but this time there was panic in their eyes. "We sealed her," one man whispered. "No," Eleanor said, her voice grim. "We only delayed her." Digging through old records, Eleanor uncovered the truth. The Bellamy family had been cursed by their own making. In their hunger for power, they had invited the entity, a force older than the land itself, promising her freedom in exchange for wealth, influence, and immortality. Instead, she devoured them, one by one. And now, through Jonathan, she was searching for a new gateway. Jonathan awoke one night standing at the edge of the village pond, the water black and glassy under the moonlight. His hands were stained red, though he had no memory of why. In the reflection, he saw the woman's face smiling back. "It's time, Jonathan. Bring them to me." Against his will, his feet turned back toward the village. Eleanor gathered the last of the old relics, preparing a final ritual. But as she drew the protective circle, a knock sounded at the door. It was Jonathan. His eyes gleamed in the dark, and the smile on his face was no longer his own. "You can't stop her," he whispered. With a scream, Eleanor lunged for the talisman, but the lights went out. The villagers gathered in the square, drawn by a compulsion they couldn't resist. Jonathan stood among them, arms raised, chanting words in a language no human should know. The ground split open, black tendrils writhing up from the earth. One by one, the villagers collapsed, their souls pulled from their bodies in shimmering streams of light. Eleanor, bleeding and gasping, crawled to the edge of the square. With her last breath, she hurled the talisman into the chasm. The earth shuddered, the tendrils recoiled. Jonathan screamed, a sound that was not his own, as the entity was pulled back, shrieking in rage. And then, silence. Months passed. Blackwood stood hollow, its streets empty, its houses abandoned. Jonathan remained in the manor, alone, or so the villagers believed. Late at night, travelers passing through the village spoke of lights in the manor windows, of a figure standing at the gate, waiting, of whispers in the wind, promising that one day she would rise again. And deep below the manor, in the darkness, something smiled. Years later, only a handful of Blackwood survivors remained, scattered, broken, and haunted. They had tried to rebuild their lives far from the cursed village, but the nightmares followed them. Eleanor's sacrifice had delayed the inevitable, but none of them truly believed it was over. Jonathan's name became a hushed legend, the man who had become the vessel, the man who had been left behind. But the world outside Blackwood remained blissfully unaware. For now. In the bustling city of Manchester, odd occurrences began. Sudden blackouts, flickering lights, whispers heard in crowded streets, shadows moving without source. Psychics reported a surge of restless spirits. News outlets covered it as urban myths. But those who had survived Blackwood knew the signs. Eleanor's great-niece, Clara, found an old journal hidden among Eleanor's things. It detailed the entity's hunger, its unfinished bond with Jonathan, and its growing reach. Clara knew she had to act. Clara tracked down the other survivors: Mark, the priest's son; Lily, the seamstress's daughter; Thomas, who had fled as a child. Each bore scars, physical or otherwise, from Blackwood. Together, they formed a desperate alliance. Their goal: return to Blackwood Manor and finish what Eleanor began. But the manor was no longer just a haunted house. It was a doorway, pulsing with dark energy, waiting to be flung wide open. As they approached the village, they saw the land itself had withered. Trees were blackened husks. The air shimmered with heatless cold. Whispers filled the wind, promising them everything they ever wanted if they'd just surrendered. Clara gripped the talisman Eleanor had left behind. "We don't surrender," she whispered. Inside the manor, Jonathan waited. He no longer looked human. His eyes were pools of black. His skin pulsed with veins of shadow. When he spoke, it was with two voices, his own and hers. "You came back," he said, smiling with cracked lips. "Good. We've been waiting." The walls shuddered. The ground beneath them split. The entity began to rise. Clara and the others formed a circle, chanting the old words Eleanor had left. But the entity was stronger now, pushing into their minds, showing them visions of loved ones lost, of endless pain. One by one, their resolve began to break, until only Clara remained. Clutching the talisman, she stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "Jonathan," she whispered, "come back." For a moment, his eyes flickered, the man fighting beneath the monster. And in that moment, Clara drove the talisman into his chest. The manor roared as if alive. The ground split open, swallowing the walls, the towers, the ancient stones. Clara was thrown back, her body shattering against the earth. Above, the entity screamed, a sound that tore through reality, shaking the sky itself, as it was dragged, clawing and shrieking, back into the void. And then, everything went still. When the sun rose, Blackwood Manor was gone. Only a hollow crater remained. Clara, broken but alive, crawled from the rubble. The others were gone, their fates unknown. Jonathan's body was nowhere to be found. As she stumbled away, she felt it. The world was quieter, the whispers faded, but not gone. She knew better. Months later, in a distant city, a child awoke from a dream, whispering words in a language her parents didn't recognize. In the darkness of her room, the shadows lengthened, and somewhere, deep beneath the skin of the world, something smiled. The story wasn't over. It was only beginning.